I never thought I'd be sharing this story, but here I am, 31 years old and finally ready to tell it. My name is Lauren, and this is how my life changed forever when I was 14. Back then, we were what you'd call a normal family, just mom, dad, and me living in our small house on Oakwood Lane. Dad worked as a mechanic, and mom was a part-time receptionist at a local clinic. We weren't rich, but we were happy. Everything fell apart the day Dad had his accident. One minute, he was heading out to work like any other Thursday morning, and the next he was gone. Just like that. A car crash on the highway. No warning. No goodbye. Mom fell apart. I mean, completely fell apart. She barely spoke, barely ate. She'd spend hours just staring at nothing, lost in her grief. So I had to learn to take care of myself pretty quickly. Then one evening, about 6 months after Dad passed, she sat me down at the kitchen table. I knew something was coming. She kept fidgeting with her coffee cup like she always did when she was nervous. "Lauren, honey," she said softly. "I need to tell you something important." I braced myself. "I've met someone. His name is David, and he makes me happy again." I should have seen it coming. The late-night phone calls, her suddenly caring about how she looked, the unexplained trips to town. But when she told me David would be moving in with us and bringing his 7-year-old son, Tyler, it still felt like a punch to the gut. "But Mom," I protested. "It's only been 6 months since Dad." "I know, sweetheart." Her voice took on that firm tone she'd started using more often lately. "But life goes on. David is a good man, and Tyler needs a mother figure. We can be a family again." A family. That's what she called it. 2 weeks later, David moved in, bringing his boxes and his son, a little boy with sandy blonde hair and big brown eyes who looked at our house like it was some kind of wonderland. Mom adored him. "Look at him, Lauren," she'd say, watching Tyler play with his toy cars. "Isn't he precious? He needs so much love and attention at this age." Yeah, he needed attention. And Mom was more than happy to give him all of it, every last bit. I became invisible. The first time I realized how things would be was at dinner a week after they moved in. David's mother, Eleanor, had come over. She took one look at me, smiled tightly, and said, "Oh, what a grown-up young lady you are." Then she reached out and pinched my cheek so hard I wanted to pull away. "Such a pretty face," she cooed, her fingers digging into my skin. Then she turned to David, her eyes scanning the room. "This house would be absolutely perfect if..." She didn't finish the sentence, but she didn't have to. I saw the way she looked at me, like I didn't belong. Like I was in the way. That night, I checked the mirror and saw faint bruises on my cheek where she had pinched me. When I showed Mom, she just sighed and shook her head. "Don't be dramatic, Lauren," she muttered. Life settled into a new routine, but not one that included me. Mom, David, and Tyler became this perfect little unit, always doing things together, movie nights, trips to the park, baking cookies in the kitchen. Meanwhile, I got shipped off to Mom's friend Melissa's house more and more often. "Lauren, honey," Mom would say, not quite meeting my eyes. "Melissa needs help with little Sophie today. You don't mind, do you?" And so off I'd go to Melissa's, where at least someone was happy to see me. Sophie was 5, with bright curly hair and a giggle that could light up a room. Every time I walked through the door, she'd shriek, "Lolo," and run into my arms. Playing with Sophie became the best part of my days. We built blanket forts, had tea parties with her stuffed animals, and read stories until she fell asleep. It was the closest thing to feeling wanted that I had. Wide with curiosity. "You have a phone?" "I want one too," she declared, reaching for it. I pulled it away before she could grab it. "Sarah, this is mine. I bought it with my own money." She stomped her foot, her lower lip trembling in that way she knew made adults rush to comfort her. "But I want one," she whined. "Then you can save up and buy one," I said, turning my back to her. Like I did. Of course, that wasn't the end of it. Less than an hour later, Mom barged into my room, arms crossed, her expression already set in that familiar look of disapproval. "Lauren, why didn't you tell me you got a phone?" she asked, her voice laced with something that sounded dangerously close to irritation. I frowned, because I bought it myself. With my own money. Mom sighed, shaking her head. You know, Sarah's been wanting a phone. It would be nice if you shared. I stared at her, my heart sinking. Mom, I worked for this. I saved for months. It's not fair for me to just give it away. Mom's lips pressed together into a thin line. It's not about giving it away, Lauren. It's about being considerate. You're the older sister now. You should set an example. I clenched my fists, my stomach twisting in frustration. No, Mom. I'm not Sarah's sister. And I'm not going to keep giving up everything just because she wants it. That was the first time I had ever said something like that to her. The first time I had ever really pushed back. Mom's expression faltered for just a second, but then she sighed again, softer this time. Just think about it, she said, before leaving my room. But I didn't need to think about it. I knew what I wanted. For the first time in a long time, I had something that was mine, and I wasn't going to let anyone take it away. Life at home didn't get easier. Mrs. Henderson was always there, her bony fingers constantly pinching and poking, her sharp tongue always finding something to criticize. You still don't sit properly at the table, she'd mutter, her claws gripping my shoulder as she forced me to sit up straighter. No wonder you look so awkward. I gritted my teeth and bore it, knowing that complaining wouldn't do anything. Mom wouldn't defend me. She never did. She was too busy doting on Sarah, making sure Robert was happy, keeping their perfect little family together. And Robert, well, he made sure I knew I wasn't part of it. If I ever forgot, he was quick to remind me. You think you're an adult just because you made a few bucks walking dogs? He sneered one evening when he caught me counting my savings at the kitchen table. You don't know what real work is. You'll never survive on your own. I didn't say anything. I just closed my notebook and walked away. But I didn't know one thing: I was going to prove him wrong. By the time I turned 17, I had saved up enough money to start planning my escape. Janet, who had become more like a mother to me than my own, had a cousin who owned a small bookstore downtown. She's looking for part-time help, Janet told me one evening as I helped clean up after dinner. I can put in a good word for you. A job. A real job. One that wasn't just babysitting or running errands for the neighbors. Yes, I said immediately. Please. A week later, I started working at the bookstore. I spent every afternoon stacking shelves, learning how to run the register, chatting with customers who actually seemed happy to see me. For the first time in years, I felt like I belonged somewhere. I still went home at night, but I started spending more and more time at Janet's. Stay for dinner, sweetheart, she'd say. It's always nice having you here. And I'd stay. Because it felt warm. Because it felt like family. The day I turned 18, I packed my bags. I had a job, I had some savings, and I had an offer from Janet to stay in her guest room until I could afford my own place. I waited until Mom was alone in the kitchen that morning. I'm moving out, I told her, my voice steady. She blinked at me, looking genuinely surprised. What? Why? I just shook my head. You know why. For a moment, she said nothing. Then she let out a tired sigh. I hope you're not making a mistake, Lauren. I'm not, I said firmly. And I wasn't. Because for the first time in my life, I was choosing myself. I walked out of that house without looking back. The heat radiating from the skin, but the pain wasn't just physical. It was deeper than that, like a final confirmation of something I had always known but never wanted to believe. My mother had chosen him over me. I stood frozen, staring at her, waiting for her to take it back, waiting for her to show some sign of regret. But there was nothing. Just cold, hard eyes and an expression that made it clear she wasn't going to change her mind. Robert sat back in his chair, arms crossed, watching with satisfaction, and Sarah, little Princess Sarah, clutched the phone Robert had stolen from me, looking smug. I didn't say a word. I just turned and walked to my room, my heart pounding, my hands shaking. I grabbed my backpack, stuffing in the few things that actually belonged to me, my clothes, my notebooks, the small stack of cash I had saved from babysitting and dog walking. I paused for only a second before pulling my acceptance letter out of my desk drawer, carefully folding it and tucking it into my bag. Then, I walked out. I didn't slam the door. I didn't cry. I just left. It was late and I had nowhere to go. My feet carried me to the only place that had ever felt safe, Janet's house. She opened the door, took one look at my face, and pulled me inside. I was wondering when this day would come, she said softly, leading me to the couch. Are you hurt? I shook my head, swallowing the lump in my throat. She hit me, I whispered, still not quite believing it. She told me to leave. Janet sighed, her face tight with anger, but she didn't push me for details. She just wrapped a blanket around me and handed me a cup of tea. You'll stay here, she said firmly, for as long as you need. And so I did. For the first time in years, I wasn't walking on eggshells. I didn't have to dodge Robert's insults or Mrs. Henderson's pinching fingers. I didn't have to sit silently at dinner while they pretended I didn't exist. For the first time, I could breathe. The next few months were a blur of working extra shifts at the bookstore, finalizing my college paperwork and saving every penny I could. Janet helped me get the things I needed: new clothes, a laptop for school, and a prepaid phone, just in case. Mom never called. I wasn't surprised. What did surprise me was the day Sarah showed up outside the bookstore. I was taking a break in the alley behind the shop when I heard her voice. Lauren. I turned to see her standing there, looking smaller than I remembered. She had grown a little since I left, but she was still the same girl who had taken everything from me without even realizing it. What are you doing here? I asked, my voice cautious. She bit her lip, looking down at her shoes. Mom told me not to come. That stung more than it should have. Then why are you here? She hesitated before pulling something from her pocket. It was my old phone, the one Robert had stolen from me. I don't want it anymore, she mumbled, holding it out to me. I stared at it for a long moment before shaking my head. Keep it, I said. It's yours now. She looked surprised, but then her eyes welled up with tears. I didn't know, she whispered. I thought you just hated me. I sighed, rubbing a hand over my face. I never hated you, Sarah. But I wasn't part of that family anymore. She nodded slowly, then turned to leave. Just before she disappeared around the corner, she called over her shoulder, Mom misses you, you know. I didn't answer, because I didn't believe her. College was a fresh start. I threw myself into my studies, met new people, and slowly, piece by piece, rebuilt my life. By the time I graduated, I had a good job lined up and enough savings to get my own apartment. One day, years later, I got a letter. It was from my mother. I almost didn't open it, but curiosity got the better of me. She wrote about how things had fallen apart after I left. How Robert had lost his job, how his mother had moved back to her own house, how Sarah had grown distant. She wrote that she was sorry. She wrote that she missed me. I folded the letter carefully and put it away. I didn't write back. Some bridges aren't meant to be rebuilt. And I was finally free. Personally greet big parties, making sure they felt welcome. It was something Maria had always done, and we kept it as part of the restaurant's charm. I smoothed my apron, grabbed a bottle of champagne for the table, and followed Jenny downstairs. The restaurant was buzzing with conversation, the warm glow of the overhead lights making the place feel even cozier. I scanned the room, looking for the party, and then I saw her. My mother. She was standing near the entrance, looking older than I remembered, but still with the same tightly pressed lips and perfectly styled hair. Robert was beside her, laughing with another man, while Sarah, no longer a child but a woman in her 20s, stood a few steps away, scrolling through her phone. I stopped in my tracks, my heart hammering in my chest. Jenny must have noticed because she followed my gaze. Is that? She started, but I gave a tiny shake of my head. I turned, heading back toward the office. I couldn't do this. But before I could escape, Sarah looked up. Our eyes met. Her mouth parted in surprise. And then she smiled. Aaron, she called, stepping forward, ignoring the rest of the party as she closed the distance between us. Jenny shot me a questioning glance, but I barely noticed. I was frozen, rooted to the floor as my past and present crashed together. Aaron, it's really you. Sarah's voice was softer now, hesitant. I didn't know you were here. I found my voice steady but distant. I own the place. Her eyes widened. You own it? She turned, looking around as if seeing the restaurant in a new light. Wow. I had no idea. I nodded, unsure what else to say. Then she bit her lip and glanced back toward the party. Mom's here, she said, quieter now. She doesn't know. Something sharp and cold twisted in my chest. Doesn't know what? I asked. Sarah hesitated. She doesn't know what happened to you. Not really. She told people you left for college and she swallowed. That you never looked back. I laughed, the sound bitter. She told people that? She never talks about that night, Sarah admitted. But I remember. I remember everything. For a moment, I was 18 again, standing in that dining room, my mother's hand stinging on my face, her voice cold as she told me to get out. I shook my head, pulling myself back to the present. It doesn't matter, I said. That was a long time ago. Sarah exhaled, looking down. I know, she said. She hesitated before looking back up at me. I'm sorry. I stared at her. Of all the things I expected to hear tonight, that wasn't one of them. Before I could respond, Robert's voice rang out across the restaurant. Sarah? What are you doing? She turned quickly, stepping back toward the party. I have to go, she murmured. But maybe we could talk? Sometime. I didn't answer. I wasn't sure what to say. She hesitated, then gave me one last look before turning and disappearing back into the crowd. Jenny was beside me in an instant. Are you okay? I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. Yeah, I said, shaking off the moment. I'm fine. But that night, as I lay in bed, I found myself staring at the ceiling, thinking about Sarah's words. I'm sorry. It wasn't much. But maybe, just maybe, it was a start. As part of our tradition, Jenny and I always went out to personally greet big parties. It was something Maria had done before she retired, and we loved the personal touch it gave our restaurant. With a smile, I grabbed a bottle of champagne, ready to welcome the guests. But the moment I stepped onto the restaurant floor, my breath caught in my throat. Sitting near the front, dressed in elegant attire, was my mother. It had been 11 years since I last saw her, but I recognized her immediately. Her hair was still perfectly styled, her posture rigid and poised, as if she were sitting for a family portrait. Beside her, Robert was chatting animatedly with another man, while Sarah, no longer the child who had once demanded everything I had, sat scrolling through her phone. I felt the ground shift beneath me. Of all the places, of all the nights, why here? Why now? Jenny must have noticed my hesitation because she whispered, Lauren, are you okay? I barely nodded, gripping the bottle a little too tightly. My instinct was to turn around and disappear before they noticed me, but it was too late. Sarah looked up. Our eyes met. Her mouth fell open slightly, her brows knitting together in shock. Then, in a voice filled with disbelief, she said, Lauren. Jenny stiffened beside me. Is that your sister? She murmured under her breath. I swallowed hard. My first instinct was to deny it, to pretend I was just another restaurant manager doing her job. But Sarah was already standing, walking toward me, her eyes wide with something I couldn't quite place. Lauren, it's really you, she said, stopping just a few feet away. I forced myself to breathe. Yeah, it's me. She glanced around the restaurant as if seeing it for the first time. This is your place? I co-own it, I said, my voice neutral. Sarah let out a breathy laugh, shaking her head. I had no idea. I didn't respond. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then she bit her lip, glancing back at the party before looking at me again. Mom's here, she said quietly, almost like a warning. She doesn't know. I arched an eyebrow. She doesn't know what? Sarah hesitated. She doesn't know what happened to you. Not really. She told people you left for college and never looked back. I felt something twist inside me. I almost laughed, but the sound never made it out. That's what she told people? I asked, my voice flat. Sarah nodded. She never talks about that night. But I remember, she admitted, lowering her voice. I remember everything. I clenched my jaw, forcing myself to stay composed. The memory of that night, the slap, the cold way my mother had told me to get out, still burned in the back of my mind. Doesn't matter, I said finally. That was a long time ago. Sarah shifted on her feet, her gaze dropping. Then, barely above a whisper, she said, I'm sorry. I blinked. Of all the things I expected her to say, that wasn't one of them. Before I could process it, Robert's voice cut through the air like a knife. Sarah? What are you doing? She turned sharply, glancing over her shoulder. I have to go, she murmured. But maybe we could talk? Sometime. I didn't answer. I wasn't sure I wanted to. She lingered for a second longer, waiting for something I wasn't ready to give. Then, with a small nod, she turned and walked back toward the party. I stood there, rooted in place, as the past and present collided in my mind. Jenny touched my arm gently. Lauren, she asked softly. I exhaled slowly, shaking off the weight of the moment. I'm fine. But that night, long after the restaurant had closed and I lay awake in bed, I found myself replaying her words. I'm sorry. It wasn't much. But maybe, just maybe, it was a start. As the last of my family was escorted out, I finally exhaled. My hands were still slightly shaking, but the weight that had been sitting on my chest for 11 years was gone. The restaurant, the business I had built from nothing, was mine, and I had just proven that I was no longer the girl they could trample over. Jenny turned to me, raising an eyebrow. You good? I touched the side of my cheek where Robert's plate had grazed me, the sting a dull ache now. Yeah, I said, straightening my blazer. I'm great. She grinned. Damn right you are. The staff had already reset the tables, and the restaurant hummed with its usual energy. A few regulars gave me encouraging nods, as if silently acknowledging what had just happened. But I wasn't thinking about my mother, or Robert, or even Sarah anymore. They were my past. And I had just made it very clear I didn't need them in my future. That night, after we closed up, Jenny and I sat in the office, sipping espresso the way Maria used to. It had become our tradition, one final moment of calm before heading home. Jenny leaned back in her chair, smirking. Well, that was a hell of a way to end the night. I laughed softly, shaking my head. Not exactly what I had in mind for a Friday. She studied me for a moment, her smirk fading. Are you okay, though? Really? I swirled my espresso, watching the dark liquid settle. Yeah. I mean, it's weird seeing them after all these years. But I don't feel sad. Or angry. Just done. Jenny nodded like she understood. You should be proud, you know. I looked up at her. Lauren, you didn't just survive them. You won. The words settled deep in my chest. And for the first time, I let myself believe them. Life moved on. A week after the engagement party disaster, I received a text from an unknown number. Sarah, I'm sorry about what happened. I didn't know Robert would do that. I stared at the screen for a long time before replying. It doesn't matter. I'm over it. She took a few minutes before responding. Sarah, Mom wants to talk to you. I sighed, rubbing my temples. After everything, now she wanted to talk? There's nothing left to say. Sarah didn't reply. And honestly, I was relieved. Months passed. The restaurant continued thriving, and Jenny and I started scouting locations for a fourth expansion. It was everything we had ever dreamed of and more. One evening, I was going through invoices when my assistant knocked on the office door. Lauren, there's someone asking for you out front. I glanced up, expecting a vendor or maybe a longtime customer. Who is it? She hesitated. She says she's your mother. My stomach clenched. I should have known she'd show up eventually. For a moment, I debated telling my assistant to send her away. But something in me, maybe curiosity, maybe closure, made me stand. I'll handle it. I stepped out into the dining area, and there she was. My mother. She looked smaller than I remembered, like she had shrunk into herself over the years. Her once perfectly styled hair had streaks of gray, and for the first time, I saw wrinkles at the corners of her eyes. She glanced around the restaurant before her gaze landed on me. Lauren. I folded my arms. Mom. She took a breath, as if steadying herself. I heard what happened at Sarah's party. I raised an eyebrow. Hard not to, I suppose. She flinched but nodded. I didn't come here to fight. I remained silent. She shifted awkwardly. You've done well for yourself. I shrugged. I had to. Something flickered across her face, something that looked almost like regret. I made mistakes, she admitted. I see that now. I laughed softly, shaking my head. You don't get to do this. You don't get to show up after 11 years and suddenly realize you made mistakes. She swallowed hard. I didn't know. I didn't realize how much I was losing. I met her eyes. That's the thing, Mom. You didn't lose me. You threw me away. She closed her eyes briefly, as if absorbing the truth of my words. When she opened them again, I saw tears. For a split second, I almost felt bad. Almost. She sniffed, wiping her hands on her coat. I just wanted to say I'm sorry. I exhaled, the tension in my chest easing. I appreciate that. She hesitated. Would you ever consider meeting for coffee? Talking? I looked at her for a long moment, then shook my head. No, Mom. I don't need closure from you. I already found it. A tear slipped down her cheek, but she nodded. I understand. And just like that, she turned and walked out of my life. For good. Later that night, as I locked up the restaurant, Jenny joined me at the door. Everything okay? I looked out into the night, my chest lighter than it had been in years. Yeah, I said with a small smile. Everything's finally okay. For the first time in my life, I truly believed it. And that was all the closure I needed. It right. But looking at the chaos unfolding online, I realized something. I didn't want reconciliation. I didn't need them to realize what they'd done. I had already built my life without them. Jenny leaned over my shoulder, watching the flood of comments and reactions pouring in. Well, that backfired on them spectacularly, she said, sipping her iced coffee. Think they'll finally leave you alone now? I exhaled slowly, setting my phone down. Maybe, maybe not. But it doesn't matter. She grinned. You sure? Because I think you just became a local legend. I rolled my eyes but couldn't help but smile. Yeah, well, I didn't ask to go viral for this. No, but it's kind of poetic justice, don't you think? I glanced at the screen again. The footage of Robert hurling the plate, my mother's stunned expression, Mrs. Henderson's dramatic meltdown, it was all undeniable. There was no twisting the truth this time, no making me the villain. And they had done it to themselves. Over the next few weeks, the online drama faded, but the consequences for my family did not. Robert lost more than just his job. His wife's family, horrified by his behavior, cut ties completely, leaving him scrambling to recover what was left of his reputation. Sarah's engagement fell apart. Her fiancé's parents didn't want the bad publicity linked to their family, and within a month, the wedding was officially canceled. My mother? She did what she always did, played the victim. She tried to frame herself as the wounded mother, betrayed by an ungrateful daughter, but the internet wasn't buying it. Every time she tried, someone posted the video again. Eventually, she deleted all her social media and disappeared from public view. And me? I kept moving forward. The restaurant was busier than ever, reservations booked months in advance. Jenny and I finally secured our 4th location, and within the year, we were scouting for a 5th. One night, as I was locking up the original restaurant, my phone buzzed with another unknown number. I almost ignored it. But something in me, curiosity, or maybe just closure, made me answer. Hello? There was silence on the other end. Then, a hesitant voice. Lauren, it's Sarah. I closed my eyes briefly, exhaling. What do you want? She hesitated. I don't know. I leaned against the counter, feeling strangely calm. Are you calling to apologize? Or just to see if I'll let you off the hook like I always used to? More silence. I don't expect you to forgive me, she said finally. I think I finally understand what it felt like. when everything was taken from you? I didn't respond right away, because the truth was, I wasn't like her. I had been left with nothing and built myself back up. She crumbled, and I wasn't going to carry her guilt for her. I hope you figure things out, Sarah, I said, my voice steady. But that's not my problem anymore. I hung up, and this time I didn't feel bad about it. A year later, Jenny and I stood outside our newest restaurant, a modern upscale bistro that we had poured months of planning and effort into. The grand opening was tonight, and the buzz around it was bigger than anything we'd done before. I looked up at the sign, our names displayed proudly above the door, and smiled. This was mine. No one had given it to me. No one had handed me success. I had built it, and I had done it without them. Jenny elbowed me playfully. Nervous? I shook my head, laughing softly. No, not even a little. Because for the first time in my life, I was exactly where I was meant to be. Seeing them in my restaurant that night, watching them try to humiliate me after all their so-called success, even after all these years, I finally understood some things can't be fixed. Some bridges aren't meant to be rebuilt. The video ended up being good for business, but that wasn't why I kept it pinned to my profile. I kept it there as a reminder for myself and for anyone else who needed to hear it. That sometimes the happy ending isn't about forgiveness or reunion. Sometimes the real happy ending is knowing you don't owe anyone a second chance. It's about choosing yourself, walking away, and never looking back. And I did. With my head held high, my future fully mine, and not a single regret. If you've made it this far, I want to hear from you. Tell me, have you ever had to walk away from people who were supposed to love you? Have you ever been told that forgiveness is the only way to heal, even when the people who hurt you never apologized, never changed? Because I've learned something on this journey, something that took me years to understand. You don't owe anyone a place in your life just because of shared blood. I want to know, what would you have done in my shoes? Would you have given them a second chance? Or do you believe, like I do, that some doors are meant to stay closed? Drop a comment below. Let's talk about it. And if you're reading this and feeling a familiar pain, if you've been cast aside, mistreated, or gaslit into believing that you're the villain in your own story, listen to me. You don't have to go back. You don't have to wait for the apology that will never come. You don't have to shrink yourself to make others comfortable. Your success is yours, and no one else gets to claim it. So if you're still struggling to let go, take it from me. You're allowed to walk away. You are allowed to build your life without them. You are allowed to put yourself first. Now tell me, what's your story? Have you ever been in a situation like this? What advice would you give to someone learning to stand on their own? Let's turn this comment section into something powerful, a place where we lift each other up instead of breaking each other down. Because sometimes, the best thing you can do is never look back.